In this video, we're going to be going over AMD's brand new RDNA 4 9070 and 9070 XT, specifically the Sapphire Pulse RX 9070 and the Sapphire Pulse RX 9070 XT. Both the latest just came out today from our friends at AMD. We're going to be comparing them with some classics. We're going to be comparing it with the XFX Radeon RX 7900 GRE graphics card, as well as the tried and true EVGA Geforce RTX 3090 FTW3 Ultra. All great cards in their time and good cards for today as well, but we're gonna find out exactly what they can do for you and if they're worth upgrading. So without wasting any more time, let's get started. We'll start things off with UL's 3D Mark Port Royale so we can test the brand new ray tracing on the 9070 series. It's supposed to be 2 times an improvement over the previous generation. Starting off, the 9070 XT has a score of 17,985. That's 22.56% above the FTW3 that comes in at 13,926. Now, the 9070 didn't come too far away from that. The 9070 came in at 15,356, which is only 14.61% below the XT. Still pretty awesome, but also 9.31% above the FTW3. That's pretty awesome because Nvidia's come in strong with ray tracing, and now AMD is trying to push hard on that. And while the 7900 GRE came in dead last, coming in at 12,721. So now moving on to Steel Nomad, we can see again the XT came in all the way at the top at 6,974. That's 22.79% above the FTW3, coming in at 5,384 Steel Nomad scores. And then again, coming in at second, we have the 9070 at 5,862 Steel Nomad scores. And once again, coming in dead last, the GRE at 4,789. It's trying real hard. But anyway, let's move on to some games. We'll start off with Cyberpunk 2077, and we'll start off first raw horsepower, and then we'll move on to ray tracing. We're not going to be using DLSS or FSR or anything along those lines, just raw horsepower. All that's going to come in a separate review when I do some gaming, so stay tuned for that in another video. So in Cyberpunk 2077, under the medium quality at 1920 by 1080, we can see the 9070 XT pulled up ahead with 246.48. That's a 17.76 increase in performance over the 3090 FTW3 that comes in at 202.69. The 9070 also took part and took second place, coming in at 215.38, which is a 5.89% improvement over the 3090. But you have to remember, the 3090 MSRP'd back in the day at 1,500, and chances are you're not going to find it for less than that. You'll find it for a lot more nowadays. The 9070 is MSRPing at $549, and the 9070 XT is coming in at $599. Now just remember, MSRP is manufacturer suggested retail price. That's what AMD's pricing it at. When Sapphire and other companies get it, they improve the quality of the cooling, of the fans, of the shroud, and of so many other things, even adding RGB. So you have to imagine that's going to add another $50, $100 to $300 on top of that MSRP. But anyway, let's move on. Now this time the GRE didn't come in last, though it did come in third, coming in at 202.94. And that card actually MSRP'd at $550 as well. That was back in 2024. Now 2560 by 1440, again at medium, we can see the 9070 XT pulled up ahead at 175.15, 20.98% above the FTW3, coming in at 139.97. The 9070 came in second at 154.11. That's only 13% under the XT. That's doing pretty awesome, and for $50 less, that's not bad at all. And the GRE comes in at third place, coming in at 139.8. That's 9.2% below the 9070 and 21% under the 9070 XT. Now the big one, Cyberpunk 2077 at 4K at medium, we can see the 9070 XT pulls up ahead at 110.13. That's an awesome score. Now second to that is the 9070 coming in at 80.9. That's 27.4% below the XT. So the XT's got a big lead there. Now this time coming in at third, we have the 3090, which gets a score of 73 53.03. And dead last is the 7900 GRE coming in at 69.65. At 1920 by 1080 Ultra, we can see the 9070 XT comes in once again all the way at the top at 196.25. And second comes in the 9070 at 169.09. Below that, the 7900 GRE coming in at 159.3, and dead last, the 3090 FTW3 coming in at 155.43. The XT took a 20.8 lead above the 3090. Now, at 2K, at Ultra, we can see the XT once again comes in at the top at 129.54. And just below that, the 9070 coming in at 113.93. Dead last this time is the 7900 GRE, but not by much, coming in at 100.32. The FTW3 only came in at 101.37. So not much of a lead there, but a win's a win. Now at 4K Ultra, we can see the 9070 XT again pulls up at top at 61.03, almost below the magical 60, but still stayed above that. Now the base 9070 came in at 53.5, so still playable, but not 100%. And then the 3090 came in at 48.6. The 9070 came in 9.16% above that. And the 7900 GRE came in at a 44.13. Not very playable. Now, jumping into ray tracing, on Cyberpunk 2077 at 1920 by 1080 on medium, we can see the 9070 XT came in at 105.52, a 13.93% lead over the 9070 coming in at 90.82. Now, actually, the 9070 wasn't second place. In this case, it was third place. Second place was the FTW3 coming in at 91.18, just slightly above the 9070. A 0.39% lead. That's not a whole lot, but a win's a win. Once again, the 3090 came in at second place, but not far ahead of the 9070. And then the 7900 GRE came in at a 73.19. While it is last, it is still playable, so not incredibly bad. Now at 2K with medium ray tracing, we can see the 9070 XT once again pulled up ahead with a 66.93, which is beautiful. Again, this is Cyberpunk at 2560 by 1440 with a medium ray tracing. But second place again comes in the 3090 coming in at 58.49. This is a ray tracing title with a ray tracing card. It actually didn't come in first. It came in second. So the 9070 XT is doing a great job. The 9070 came in at 56.92. Playable, but every so often you might get a little stutter. But dead last, we have the 7900 GRE coming in at 46.04. Sadly, not very playable. Now, ray tracing at 4K under medium was a completely different story. Nothing was playable, but still the 9070 XT came up above, coming in at 31.14. Not playable, but it was still the top. And 1920 by 1080 with ray tracing at Ultra, the 1920 by 1080, the 9070 XT came in at 82.76. That's number one. Now, number two here was the EVGA Geforce RTX 3090 FTW3 coming in at 75.33, only 8.97% below the 9070 XT. So the card is still holding its own weight. Now at third place, the 9070 came in at 69.63, and again, dead last, 7900 GRE came in at 54.24. Still playable, but last. Now at 2K with ray tracing set to Ultra, we can see the 9070 XT came in at 52.11. That's still playable with an occasional chug. Not perfect, but it's there. And then second came the 3090 FTW3 at 48.53. Now, the XT came in above the 3090 FTW3 by 6.87%. Not a ton, but it's still up above. And the XT came in much more playable than the 3090, coming in at 48.53. And third place goes to the 9070 at 43.28. Lastly, 4K at ray tracing Ultra is going to be sad, but the 9070 XT came in at 25.25. Horrible. And you can only imagine what the rest came in at. I'll leave that here on the screen. I won't go over that. Let's move on to the next game. Black Myth Wukong at 1920 by 1080 at medium quality. The 9070 XT comes in at 179 frames per second. That's about 13% over the 3090 FTW3 coming in at 157 frames per second. But in this case, the 9070 came in at second at 170 frames per second. Now at very high at 1080p, we can see the 9070 XT comes in first at 94 frames per second. Second, the 9070 comes in at 88 frames per second. That's 6.4% below the XT. Not a bad percentage whatsoever. And then third place, we can see the 3090 FTW3 coming in at 85 frames per second. That's 3.4% below the 9070. Now, Black Myth Wukong at 2K, at the medium preset, we can see the 9070 XT once again pulls up at the top, coming in at 170 frames per second. Second to that is the 9070 at 151 frames per second. And third is the 3090 FTW3, 10% below the 9070. So still the 3090 is holding its weight, but it's kind of struggling. Dead last is the 7900 GRE coming in at 107 frames per second. Still very playable though. Now at 4K, under the medium preset, we can see the 9070 XT once again comes out at top, coming in at 130 frames per second, 10.30% above second place. Second place in this case was the 7900 GRE coming in at 116.6. That's only 1 frame per second away from third place, which is the 9070. And in this case, dead last was the 3090 FTW3 coming in at 101 frames per second. Now at 4K, very high, things start to struggle a little. We can see the 9070 XT comes in at 68 frames per second. It starts to get into the danger zone here. Now second to that, unfortunately, 1 frame per second below the magical 60, coming in at 59 frames per second. That's 13.2% below the XT. Now third to that is the 3090 FTW3 coming in at 54 frames per second. Not the magical 60, but that's still playable. And dead last on this one, the 7900 GRE coming in at 51 frames per second. That's still kind of playable, so that one's not out just yet. Now things start to get a little interesting because there isn't just ray tracing on or off, but there's a few pieces in between that. So we have a few more here. Now at 1080p with the medium preset and medium ray tracing preset, the 3090 FTW3 came up above, coming in at 106 frames per second. The card that's typically either third or dead last came in number 1. So that's pretty awesome. Now coming in number 2 was the 9070 XT coming in at 78 frames per second. So thankfully still very playable, but very much below the 3090 FTW3 coming in at a 35.9% decrease in performance. Third to that was the 9070 coming in at 75 frames per second, still incredibly playable. And then dead last, the 7900 GRE coming in at 25 frames per second. That took a beating. It didn't like ray tracing whatsoever. Again, at 1080p with the medium preset, this time very high ray tracing, we can see the 3090 FTW3 came in at 78 frames per second. The 9070 XT came in at 51 frames per second. That's a 34.6% decrease in performance over the 3090. But on third place came in the 9070 at 50 frames per second. That's still kind of playable. You might notice a chug or two, but that still comes in great. Now the very high preset at medium ray tracing at 1080p, we can see again the 3090 FTW3 takes the lead, coming in at 79 frames per second. Then the 9070 XT comes in at the magical 60 frames per second, 24% below the 3090 FTW3. Third place is the 9070 coming in at 54 frames per second. At the very high preset with very high ray tracing, things start to get incredibly interesting. And again, at 1080p, we can see number 1 here is the 3090 FTW3, but coming below the 60 is 57 frames per second. Below that is the 9070 XT coming in at 41 frames per second, 28% below the 3090 FTW3. And in third place, we can see the 9070 coming in at 38 frames per second. At 2K with the medium preset and medium ray tracing, we can see the FTW3 took the lead once again, coming in at 85 frames per second. This time, the 9070 took the lead, coming in at 67 frames per second, but the 9070 XT came in just below that at 66 frames per second. A 1.5% difference, but a difference is a difference. And for once, the XT comes in at third. 2K with the medium preset set to very high ray tracing. We can see the 3090 FTW3 comes in at 59 frames per second, while the 9070 XT comes in at 48 frames per second, and below that, the 9070 comes in at 45 frames per second. That's a 6.5% decrease in performance over the 9070 XT. And once again, embarrassingly, the 7900 GRE comes in at 13 frames per second. Now, 2K high with no ray tracing, we can see the 9070 XT takes the lead, coming in at 90 frames per second. Now, coming in second place, the 9070 comes in at 82 frames per second. That's an 8.8% decrease in performance over the XT, which isn't bad at all. And then coming in third is the FTW3, coming in at 74 frames per second. And dead last is the 7900 GRE, coming in at 56 frames per second. That's still playable though. 2K with the very high preset and medium ray tracing, we can see the 3090 FTW3 comes in at 64 frames per second. That's 21.9% above the 9070 XT, coming in at 50 frames per second. You're gonna get some good gameplay, but that'll chug. Now below that comes the 9070 coming in at 49 frames per second, a 2% decrease in performance over the XT. Now at 2K with the very high preset and very high ray tracing, we can see the 3090 FTW3 comes in at 44 frames per second. Below that, the 9070 XT took a 25% hit, coming in at 33 frames per second. And below that, the 9070 comes in at 32 frames per second. At 4K with the medium preset and medium ray tracing, we can see the 3090 FTW3 comes in at 52 frames per second. That's still kind of playable. And 11.53% below that, we can see the 9070 XT comes in at 46 frames per second. Below that, the 9070 comes in at 40 frames per second. At 4K with the medium preset and the very high ray tracing, we can see the 3090 FTW3 comes in at 33 frames per second. That's 15.15% above the 9070 XT, coming in at 28 frames per second. Now third place is the 9070 coming in at 24 frames per second. At 4K with the very high preset and medium ray tracing, we can see the 3090 FTW3 pulls ahead again at 39 frames per second, 7.7% above the 9070 XT at 36 frames per second. It's above, but I mean, unplayable is unplayable. Now this is going to be sad, but at 4K with very high preset and very high ray tracing, we can see they're all bad. I'm not going to bother with this one. You can see it on the screen here. They're all bad. So let's move on to the next game. Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered. Beautiful game. We can see at 1920 by 1080 at the medium preset, the base 9070 comes up ahead by 197 frames per second, 3.0% above the 9070 XT, coming in at 191 frames per second. Still both very playable, but still the 9070 came up above the 9070 XT. That's pretty strange. Now coming in third place is the 3090 FTW3, coming in at 186 frames per second. And fourth, though still not bad, is the 7900 GRE, coming in at 177 frames per second. That's still pretty nice. Now 1080p, very high. This time we can see the 9070 XT came up above, coming in at 186 frames per second. 9.7% above the 9070, coming in at 168 frames per second. And then third place here, the 3090 FTW3 comes in at 154 frames per second. Not far behind that is the 7900 GRE, coming in at 149 frames per second. At 2K medium, we can see the 9070 XT takes the lead, coming in at 183 frames per second. Second place here is the 9070 coming in at 165 frames per second. Third is the 3090 FTW3 coming in at 149 frames per second. And lastly, the 7900 GRE coming in at 139 frames per second. All still incredibly playable, and this one is at 2K, so that's pretty awesome. Now at 2K, very high, still all incredibly playable. The 9070 XT comes in at 156 frames per second, while the 9070 comes in at 141 frames per second. Third here is the 3090 FTW3 coming in at 130 frames per second. And last, but definitely not least, the 7900 GRE comes in at 126 frames per second. All incredibly beautiful and playable scores. Now at 4K medium, the 9070 XT comes in at 125 frames per second. Below that, the 9070 comes in at 123. Below that, the 3090 FTW3 comes in at 122. Now the 7900 GRE hurts a little tiny bit, but not as bad, coming in at 116 frames per second. Now coming in next, 4K at very high. We can see the 9070 XT comes in at 122 frames per second, but the 9070 also comes in at 122 frames per second. So they're matching on that one. Incredibly strange. Third place is the 3090 FTW3 coming in at 120 frames per second. Now, not very below that, the 7900 GRE comes in at 109 frames per second. We can see where the 9070, where the 9070 XT, where the 3090 FTW3, and the 7900 GRE stands, gaming-wise at least. The 9070 XT is taking the lead in just about everything, and the 9070 right below that, not very far below that, is mostly right in second place. But there is still rendering. Now, because I'm always working, I'm always reviewing, I'm very rarely playing games anymore, rendering is tremendous for me. The least time it could take, the better it is for me. For the longest time, I was using the 3090 FTW3, and it was great. I've moved on to the 4090, but that's not part of this review. I had to get this out quick. We can see here the 9070 XT comes in first, coming in at 1 minute and 9 second rendering time. I'll put a link down below so you can check out D5 if you want to play with it yourself. You can see how long it takes you. Let me know down below how long it takes you. Then we can see the 9070 comes in at 1 minute and 17 seconds. A little bit slower, not much. Then we can see the FTW3 comes in at 1 minute and 42 seconds. Still not very much higher than the 9070 and the 9070 XT, but it's still slower. And again, dead last, the 7900 GRE comes in at 2 minutes and 26 seconds. Again, that's not a ton. It's not going to kill you to wait a few extra seconds, but every second counts when you're rendering. Now, the prices I gave you were MSRP prices. We know that the prices are going to be higher, again, not because they want to make them incredibly higher, but because MSRP is manufacturer suggested retail pricing. That's what AMD's pricing is. Again, Sapphire, XFX, all the other companies, they have to add their own parts, so that makes it cost a little bit more. That's why you're never going to find cards at MSRP. RGB, better cooling, better fans, better fin stack, better thermal paste, better capacitors. They're not free. Unfortunately, you have to pay for that, but you get quality out of that. So that's why it makes sense. I don't like it either, but it makes sense. So aside from that, I think AMD has done an amazing job with the 9070, the 9070 XT and the 9070 over the older cards. So definitely a card worth upgrading to. Now, I was going to also review the 5070, maybe one day close the 5090, but that got held up in customs. And a lot of the other parts that I had took too long to ship over because of the weather. It's been snowing just about everywhere. And then people decided just to be a little lazy. That's why I'm kind of doing this last minute and rushing so much. But anyway, this is Iggy with This Bites For You, giving you my review of the 9070 and the 9070 XT, coming from our friends at AMD, but specifically the Sapphire editions. I'd love to get your opinion, first off on the review. This has been my largest review. And second off, what you think about the cards. This is Iggy with This Bites For You out. See you guys.